All right, well, thanks everyone for coming along this morning. My name is George Seymour. I'm the Fraser Coast Mayor, and I'm talking today here about the architecture of Maryborough, specifically the historic architecture of Maryborough. I'm going to talk about a few different architects and some of their signature buildings and how they've sort of represent the development of Maryborough over the decades. There are, of course, other architects which I'm not covering today, which can be the subject of a further talk. Perhaps the most significant architect for Maryborough in the 1860s and Queensland in the 1860s was this man, Charles Tiffin. So Charles Tiffin was actually appointed as the Queensland colonial government architect in December 1859. Queensland only separated from New South Wales in 1859, so he was one of the first employees. The very first employee of the new Queensland government was Richard Bingham Sheridan, who was appointed as the customs collector here in Maryborough. But Charles Tiffin was one of those early, very first public servants. Obviously, we got thousands and thousands of public servants now, but he was one of the very first as the colonial government's architect. And one of the really significant buildings he designed was our post office. This is in 1865, and it has been in continuous use for 150 years. As a post office, still in its original use. Built on the corner of Bazaar and Wharf Street, it sort of sets the scene for the whole street. That whole street has more heritage listed buildings than most places in Queensland. There are 300 buildings that are designed by Charles Tiffin right across the state. Most of the buildings that survive from the 1860s are. But you'll see this one, like a lot of historic buildings, has changed a little. You'll see the difference between that and how it exists today. There's a fourth floor added to the tower. And originally there wasn't a clock. There was a time ball. So at 1 o'clock every day, that ball would be lowered, and that would signify principally to the ships, but other people associated with the wharfs, the time. It took Maryborough quite a while to get a timepiece. The other, between that time ball and us getting a clock, when it got higher, and then in the Maryborough City Hall, we had the time cannon, which we still use today for ceremonies. The time cannon was discovered by the Member of Parliament for Maryborough, and the Queensland Premier in an island in the Torres Strait, originally from the Dutch East Indias Trading Company. So Charles Tiffin, he also designed, that's another photo, after it's added the fourth tower, the fourth floor. He also designed our Bond store in the 1860s. It has been added to, but the original part that Charles Tiffin designed is this back lower level. He also designed the Queensland Parliament House. And he was very active in the Brisbane School of Arts and the Queensland Philosophical Society. His interests extended to principles of ventilation and sanitation, and he developed the earth closet, which became the accepted installation for the disposal of night soil. So architects back at that time were people that were very intellectually interested in the problems of the day. So you found them being interested in sanitation particularly, but as well as ventilation and health. Another really significant early architect was Francis Drummond Greville Stanley, FDG Stanley. So if you think most of the 1860s sandstone and brick buildings that we have surviving were by Charles Tiffin. Most of the 1870s and 1880s were by Stanley, and he had the position of Queensland Government Architect after Tiffin. One of his really beautiful buildings he designed was the Maryborough Courthouse. And so most of our early images we have of Maryborough, particularly Wharf Street, are from the post office tower. And this is looking down Wharf Street towards the wharfs over to the old customs house, which was, like so much, was flooded and destroyed by the record flood of the 1890s. But also here we have the courthouse from the 1870s. And you can see originally the entrance wasn't to Richmond Street, it was actually to Wharf Street, through a garden, and it became more formal than this. This image is still a lawn, but it became more formal. And it wasn't until the 1930s when the state government office building was built on that site in the interwar Georgian revival style. And this is a little bit later, obviously, and shows the planting up of that front garden to the courthouse and much of Wharf Street, including the Bank of New South Wales, the Customs House Hotel. And by this is obviously after 1901 because you can see that it's got the new Customs House residence, perhaps. But other buildings designed by Stanley include the Girls' Grammar School here in Maryborough, as well as the Australian Joint Stock Bank, which was designed in 1883, and then is now the Story Bank. It's where the author of Mary Poppins, P.L. Travers, was born. So much of the bank buildings, the churches like St. Mary's, they were designed by Stanley in the 1880s and 1870s. Oh yeah, this is not actually an architect, this is the builder. So this is actually John Thomas Annear, and he won the tender for the construction of the courthouse. And he completed the task in under a year, but he was elected as an alderman on the town council. And then midway through the construction in February 1877, he became the mayor of Maryborough. He would later serve as the member of parliament for Maryborough in the Queensland Parliament for 19 years. And this is the Girls' Grammar School. Obviously, it's part of the Maryborough State High School now. The Girls' Grammar School looks across Kent Street to the Boys' Grammar School site. And this is the Bank of Stories, which was the Australian Joint Stock Bank, then later the Union Bank. And then we acquired it a couple of years ago to turn it into an experience about Mary Poppins. And actually, you can see on this, for a while, they had, Maryborough's gone through a few different stages in having balconies. And just like Queenslanders, how people open them up and then close them up. You can see here where they had a balcony, and that was the door, where it no longer has a circular window. With the balconies, the raised veranda has been taken away. This is John Grainger. He was a very significant architect for many decades, a very brilliant architect, and he designed our School of Arts building. This is looking across. This picture would probably have been taken from the old ambulance tower, do you think, Tony? Probably, by the courthouse, by the City Hall. And you see in the background St. Stephen's, which I'll talk about in a minute. But John Grainger designed the School of Arts building here in Maryborough for us. But it wasn't our first School of Arts. The School of Arts was one of the early institutions of Maryborough, and an earlier timber structure was erected in 1861. These institutions encouraged adult education, both technical and cultural, and were the forerunners to our public library system as well as our TAFEs, so to enable people to continue learning and develop new interests. Maryborough grew throughout the 1860s and 1870s through a number of capacities, but primarily as the port for the Gympie Gold Rush in the late 1860s and early 1870s. And it was found that the old School of Arts structure could no longer meet the demand. So in 1886, a design competition was run for the new building, and 31 entries were received from right across the colonies. In November, it was announced that the architect John Grainger had won with this design. He was responsible for many really fine buildings right across Australia and New Zealand, including the Prince's Bridge in Melbourne, the Fremantle Town Hall, the Parliament in Perth, as well as other buildings in New Zealand. That's another more recent view of it. The bust above the door is Minerva, who is the Roman goddess of wisdom. This is a view up in the reading room of the School of Arts. And that's close-up of Minerva. John Grainger, as brilliant as he was, and how he was at the forefront of architecture for many, many years. He was a brilliant architect, but he was actually a bit of a cad. His wife left him, Rose, after he gave her syphilis. He lost all their money. He was a real womanizer. He gambled. So he was a great architect, but he wasn't a very nice person so much, to his family at least. But his son, Percy Grainger, is actually the most famous of his family. He is one of the top composers to come from Australia. has a very high opinion of himself. I've been to the Percy Grainger Museum in Melbourne, which he set up. He established a scientific system to rate the top composers of the world, throughout history, and he put himself somewhere above Mozart, and it was really, but he was a very, you can probably get his CDs here at the library, but he was a very fine composer and musician. And so him and his mother toured the world doing concerts, and he spent a lot of time in England and the US. So whilst the School of Arts is by no means his most famous, Grainger's most famous building, it was for many years highly regarded. So in the Sydney Mail on the 26th of January 1895, it was referred to as the pride of every Maryborough citizen. Outside of Brisbane, it is the finest institution of its kind in Queensland, externally and internally. It is the line of the town, and every visitor is duty-bound to go over the institution and admire it with fervour. Its present state of blessedness is the result of many years of intelligent and discriminating labour. So this architect in the top left-hand corner, so this is a photograph of the building committee of the Maryborough Stedford, which is actually on right this week at the Brolga Theatre. But the man in the top left-hand corner is Philip Oliver Ellard Hawkes, who built much of Maryborough between the wars. His very first activity here was organising the Peace Ball in Maryborough City Hall, and then throughout the 20s and the 30s, he designed residences, churches, memorials, offices, and basically anything that needed to be done. So this is the book I wrote about Philip Oliver Ellard Hawkes. This is the only other photograph we have of him. So for many, many years, that was the only one we had, and he's obviously the third from the left. This is a group of the Maryborough Chamber of Commerce. So this is one of his very first buildings. So in Maryborough, before he arrived in Maryborough, he worked in Bundaberg, Wagga Wagga, Kingaroy, in Melbourne, in the firm of John Grainger. So he learned quite a bit from John Grainger. So he worked right around the country before settling in Maryborough. And one of his very first buildings after the war was the Finnemore's Dental Surgery, which is on Richmond Street, opposite, very near the Storybank. You can see it's got quite traditional features, but it's interesting building material, sort of asbestos concrete sheeting. And the council was a bit wary about this because it didn't really fit in with the area, but given it was right after the war, they were keen to approve anything to be built. They wanted to see more building and economic activity, so they allowed it. And then for many, many years, it was a dental surgery and then an accounting office. This is, he designed a lot of war memorials. So what you see here is St. Paul's, Church of England in the center, then on the left, the bell tower, and then the memorial, the World War I Memorial Hall. And even though they're by three different architects, the Gothic architectural style has been continued throughout all of them. And for a while, there was the bomb shelter here along the edge, along Elena Street. But Hawkes designed this memorial hall, as well as the cenotaph here in Maryborough, the memorial hall in Goumeri, the Pyalba Memorial. So he was called upon to do a lot of community-based memorials and other structures. He also built much of the Maryborough Hospital, including the nurses' quarters, twice actually. This was the second nurses' quarters he designed for the Maryborough Hospital. It's no longer used, unfortunately. That's not how they train nurses anymore. The Hotel Carlton he designed, and he designed a very similar one in Goumeri as well, the Grand Hotel. It's quite a few very distinctive hotels. This is in the jazz style architecturally. The movie theatre on the right, he designed that as well. He designed a lot of movie theatres in Maryborough and Bundaberg. This is what the Mansoor family was a very significant merchants and commercial traders for many, many years. There still are, obviously, still here, principally in the medical field. One of the descendants, Lisa Mansoor, married Campbell Newman. So this is an example of what Hawkes was doing in the 1920s. And most of his buildings incorporate, this is his signature, where you got sort of 3 keystones and an arch. But I've included it here because it demonstrates the change in style. So this is what they were doing in the 1920s, very decorative and ostentatious. And then in the 1930s, hopefully this is right, this is for the same family, the Mansoor family, the same purpose, where you have the commercial presence downstairs, so shops, and upstairs a residence, which is what you had across Maryborough, whether it was a dental surgery, a banking, or a silk merchant. But you can see in that decade, between the early 1920s and 1936, that the styles had changed dramatically to a much simpler, plainer style, the fashion. I've included this here to show you how different architects sort of over the decades, their talents will be brought together. So this is St. Mary's Catholic Church. Again, an image taken from the post office tower. But it doesn't look anything like that anymore. For a start, you can't see the bricks, and you can't see the stone coining anymore. And the surrounding buildings, like the old Maryborough City Hall, isn't there anymore. It's also a lot smaller. So this is what Charles Tiffin designed. And then several decades later, FDG Stanley, expanded upon it. And then in the 1930s, Hawks expanded on it further in both directions and added new features such as the rooster and other motifs. So those 3 architects have given, as well as rendering the whole building. So if you want to see what the building surface was originally, if you go down this side alleyway, there's one door where they've kept the original bricks and the stone coining without the rendering over it. This architect is Robin Dodds. He's one of the most sort of celebrated and recognized architects of Queensland. And in 1908, he provided the design for the Maryborough City Hall. This was the second town hall. We originally had a timber structure that was on the opposite side of the road next to the School of Arts. So City Hall is one of Maryborough's best known buildings. It was originally opened about 111 years ago on the 17th of June, 1908. What's really interesting about it is the building was entirely financed by a public citizen, just one man. The council didn't have enough money to do it, so George Ambrose White provided the money to build it. I think it's about £8,000. He had earlier provided the money for the city baths, which were now where the band hall is now. He provided that on the condition that children always be admitted for free. And this is an image of the town hall not long after it was officially opened in 1908. So Dodds was one of the most accomplished architects to ever work in Queensland. He was from the renowned Brisbane firm Hall & Dodds. He's best known for his residential work, church and commercial designs, and this is actually the only known civic building that he did. The architectural style is American colonial and Georgian. So there was, it came about because there was a lot of dissatisfaction with the earlier timber hall. Whilst the town didn't have enough money to replace it, there was recognition that it didn't represent the role of Maryborough in the colony and in the country and what a significant place it was. So it was officially opened by the local MP Andrew Fisher, who had served as the country's 9th Prime Minister. In 1964, the words Town Hall were replaced with City Hall, even though it had, we were a city before the building had even finished. And you'll notice it's quite a bit different now. So in the 1930s, they added the large tower at the back, which helps with the stage and curtains. And of course, the clock tower was added in the 1930s. This is an image of it after they've added that. And you can see that this is a very popular area, particularly for older men to meet and discuss. The very first things happened when I got elected was I was given a key to City Hall, which really meant a lot to me. I love City Hall. I can't believe my office is in there. So I love being part of the history of it. And when I was in Italy earlier this year, in Florence and Venice and Verona, and we kept going to different places like the Medicis and the Doge of Venice, and they all had a coat of arms, like a political logo, which represented what was important to them. So I was in Florence 2 or 3 months ago, and I came up with an idea for my own logo. So that's my sort of coat of arms. Obviously, politically, it's got to have the hinterland, Maryborough, and the bay. So I sort of combined them all up, but that's sort of my political logo, hopefully, from now on. This is another image of it early, not long after it had been added to in the 1930s. And you can see that because there was a second story added here a few decades later. This is an architect who's not so much for buildings, but bridges. This is Alfred Barton Brady, and he designed the Lamington Bridge after 1896, after the record flood here. So we had a record flood in 1893, which wiped out a lot of infrastructure, including the Maryborough Bridge, which is where the Lamington Bridge is now. The Maryborough Bridge was a very high timber bridge, and it got washed away, along with some men that were on it who survived, fortunately. So the loss of that essential bridge, it was very significant because that was the connection with the south, and it was also brought water into the town. So they had to very quickly come up with a plan to replace it, the Maryborough and Tanana councils. Originally, they wanted to just replace it with the exact same type of bridge, but Barton Brady, he recognized what was the problem with these floods is that the water would raise up and all the trunks and other debris would come in and smash against the superstructure up at the top level. So he came up with the idea to keep the bridge really low, and so that the flood waters would go high above it and it would be protected underneath the water and actually not get washed away. So this design was very innovative because it went contrary to the traditional thinking of the time that you want to build as high as possible. He designed it so that it would get flooded, would get overtaken, but would survive when the floodwaters went down. What was also significant was the material. Not only did the councils want to build again high, but they also wanted to build with timber. He designed the very first reinforced concrete bridge in the country, and that's the Lamington Bridge. So it still survives much like that today. That's it being constructed in the 1890s. Here's a postcard not long after. It's since been widened, and we have cantilevered footpath to the side. I don't have a modern picture of that, but Lamington Bridge, obviously, it's very significant on a national level for its innovative design and use of materials. The same flood affected Bundaberg very badly, and the Burnett Bridge there is designed by Barton Brady as well.
What did they call it, Lamington?
Yeah, so Lamington was the state's governor at the time. The spongy coconut chocolate dessert is made by him as well because his chefs designed it. So it was actually quite controversial. It wasn't until people got the invitation from the Bridge Board, who were very unpopular, the Bridge Board. They got this invitation from the Bridge Board saying, come to the Lamington Bridge opening, and nobody knew what that meant. People wanted it to be called the Maryborough Bridge. And what they thought was happening is the Bridge Board were sucking up to the governor, wanting to get like an appointment or wanting to get some sort of patronage. So it was to please the governor, who really didn't have much to do with Maryborough, that they named it the Lamington Bridge. But people got used to it very quickly, and obviously the Lamington Hotel. What they really didn't like is the toll. Obviously they're all toll bridges back then when they opened. But it was preferable to getting the punt across. There was a little ferry system when the bridge was out. So, I mean, there was even like the name change. There was a protest of over 200 people at Town Hall, which is quite significant for the time. This building is a very open building. It's in the dead heart of town, in the cemetery. And this is by Willoughby Powell, who was an architect who was here for a short period, but really left a mark. So Bill Clinton once said, being president is like being the groundskeeper in a cemetery. There are a lot of people under you, but none of them are listening. And that's perhaps what it's like being mayor as well. But this was designed in 1883 by Willoughby Powell, who was a very industrious and gifted architect in the colonial Queensland. He had trained in England before migrating in 1872, and he adapted a lot of the English designs to here. So, for example, Badow House he designed, and if you take away its balcony, its sort of Queensland features, it's really just a Georgian mansion. So he took these sort of English designs and incorporated sort of Queensland climatic adaptations. So while he was here, as well as Badow House, he also designed the Federal Hotel.
What is its significance?
Yeah. Mm-hmm. So the Mortuary Chapel, it's right in the center of the cemetery. So on each side, it would be a different denomination. So it's right in the center where they can have ceremonies. It's a non-denominational sort of structure. It's very open. So people could they would usually have a ceremony at a church. There'll be a long convoy almost to the cemetery. Then they'd have a further smaller ceremony here. People call it the rocket ship now, but it's called the Mortuary Chapel. The seats are really, really low, and it's thought that he did that so children could sit there, but adults wouldn't feel comfortable sitting so low, and they would stand out of respect. So yeah, it was used as a secondary place for people to have ceremonies in the middle of the cemetery before the burials. This man is Benjamin Joseph Backhouse. And like I showed you earlier, that image of the School of Arts, you can see in the background a landmark, St. Stephen's. So a lot of the early images, that was a landmark for Maryborough because it's this really distinctive spire. So trees and other buildings have kind of crowded it out, but it's still very visible from right across town now. It was a Presbyterian church, where the very first Presbyterian church was actually around where City Hall is now. But in other buildings which were used for different purposes, which was very typical for the time. But in June 1865, the foundation stone was laid for a brick church, which is now the church hall next to St. Stephen's. So the older brick church is just to that side. But as Maryborough, like other facilities, as Maryborough grew, they needed to expand to get bigger and better facilities. So the foundation stone for this church was laid in 1880, with the doors officially opening just over a year later on the 20th of November, 1881. It's designed in the Gothic style, as again by the highly accomplished architect Benjamin Joseph Backhouse. He was a really extraordinary individual with a lot of interests. He was a successful architect, but he was also an alderman on the Brisbane City Council. He was a member of the New South Wales Parliament for about 9 years and held many public positions. He designed many of the principal buildings around Brisbane at the time. And whilst he won the award to design the Queensland Parliament, they had a design competition and his award was accepted as the best. They actually, because of budget considerations, just used Charles Tiffin's design, which would have been really devastating for an architect to have the most prominent building, going to be yours, and then they just get the public servant's design. But other buildings still survive around Brisbane. He and his wife Lydia arrived from England in 1853, and together they had 17 children. And so Australia gained a lot from his family. He was a leading social reformer. He helped form the Sanitary Reform League and was an advocate for improved urban sewerage systems. So it's a really handsome building on the outside, but it's really interesting internally as well. The floor slopes down, which is quite unique for a church in a regional town like this, so that everybody has a good view. It's got a really beautiful organ as well from Manchester.
Is the roof of the spire, is it zinc?
I think it might be, yeah.
Yeah.
I suspect it is, yeah. So this is George Mansfield. He was a very prominent architect, particularly around Sydney. So he was born in 1834 in Sydney. His father, the Reverend Ralph Mansfield, had been a Methodist missionary, and he was educated at the privately run school and then articled to the architect John Frederick Hilly. So this is the Bank of New South Wales, and it's very much unchanged to now. This is the corner of Richmond and Wharf Streets. All 4 buildings on that corner are on the State Heritage Register. So you got the sort of the Customs House Hotel, the Customs House, and the state government offices. But this building, apart from a few additions over here to the left of it, is very much unchanged. Downstairs is now the Maryborough, the Family Heritage Institute, and upstairs is the Maryborough and District Family History Society. So it's houses people doing family history research and research about the region. This is a very significant architect for Australia, John Smith Murdock. He's particularly well known for all his work in Canberra. So Walter Burley Griffin designed the large concept of Canberra, and along with his wife, but the actual details were filled in by John Smith Murdock. So when you go to Canberra, if you see the original Parliament House, the Hotel Kurrajong, the different office blocks, they were all designed by John Smith Murdock. He also designed here in 1899 and 1900 the Customs House residence and the Customs House, sort of in the Federation Arts and Crafts style. These replaced the earlier structures here that were destroyed in the 1893 flood. In the background you see the state government offices, which took the place of that formal garden and entranceway for the courthouse, and this is the bond store. So John Smith Murdock, he had a very dry and quiet personality. For somebody who's had a very significant impact on Australia, they used his parliament for between about 1925 and 1988, the design for his parliament. There's only 2 known photographs of him, and in both of them he's not even looking at the camera. So he's a very shy and introverted man. He was a member of the Masonic order, and it's claimed he incorporated a lot of their sort of representations and designs, a bit like Dan Brown, into his architectural styles.
Was that Customs House built where the old one was? Is that the same?
Yeah, they used the same block more or less, yeah. Yeah, because it had to be in the center of the Wharf portside area. So what you have along Wharf Street is the bond store, the Customs House, and all the wharves, like where the Military Museum is, Gallagher's. So every building in that little area had a function to do with, and that's why you had, because that's where the wealth was, it's where the gold was leaving the colony, that's why you had the banks there as well. So they couldn't move it to higher ground, it had to be near the banks of the river. For this next architect, I actually don't have a photograph of him because it was his mother and his sisters that were famous. But Victor Carandini, in the late 1880s, he designed a couple of really interesting buildings in around Maryborough. This was the Royal Bank of Queensland, but it's now a doctor's surgery. The Mansoor, it is, yeah, like the other buildings, yeah. So they've moved into this now. So he designed this. This architectural style would be described as Mannerist. It's very flamboyant, obviously, and a lot of details and fluted columns. So Victor Carandini, he designed this in 1889, which was the same year he also designed the Post Office Hotel. He was the son of Marchese Jerome Cardini di Soranzo, who was an Italian nobleman, the 10th Marquis of Sorzano. But he had to flee Italy in 1835 for revolutionary activities against the Austrian overlords. So him and his wife, Maria, were married in Hobart in 1843. She was a very famous opera singer. Maybe that's all just the sisters, actually. But she was a very famous opera singer, and so were her daughters. So they had 9 children, one of whom died as a child, which is pretty standard for the 1880s. The 5 daughters were involved in musical tours as an opera troupe and were famous throughout the colonies. One of Victor Carandini's brothers, Frank, had a grandson, Christopher Lee, who's obviously was a very famous actor in Dracula and even in, I think, Harry Potter. So that bank building was designed in the standard where you have the banking chamber and offices on the ground floor, and then a residence for the manager on the upper level, which was common for much of Maryborough. This is nearby. This is now known as Woodstock House. It's a very handsome building. It was designed by Frederick Faircloth, better known as Herb Faircloth, who was principally based in Bundaberg. I don't have a photograph for him, unfortunately. But he was quite active around the region. So like that very large war memorial in the center of Bourbon Street in Bundaberg was designed by him, as well as most of Childers. So after Childers, the main street was destroyed by a fire. They engaged him to basically rebuild it. So the really fine buildings with the striking parapets were designed by Herb Faircloth. So this building actually had its origins much earlier in 1863, but was then reconstructed on site to Faircloth's design in 1914. Faircloth was the son of the police magistrate George Faircloth and a pupil to the German-trained Bundaberg architect Anton Heydrich, who designed the School of Arts building in Bundaberg. As per the photograph, you can see it's a two-story building with its windows, the windows and everything's almost an identical spot to the earlier building. So he really tried to replicate it, but add new aspects. So in 1966, the building was sold to the Berkshire Council. It had been the Queensland National Bank. And the Berkshire, which became the Hervey Bay Shire. So the Berkshire, even though it was the surrounding area, had their headquarters within the Maryborough city boundary. The name Woodstock House, which currently appears on the building's parapet, wasn't added until much later in the 1970s, when it was purchased by the doctors Dunn and Pearson for use as a surgery, Woodstock being the name of Dr. Dunn's house. So I've tried to cover a number of the significant landmark buildings in Maryborough and talk a bit about the architects, because each one of these buildings, and you see here Maryborough as it was seen in the late 1800s from Post Office Tower, each one of these buildings was first came to life in the minds of these architects before it became bricks and mortar. And I think by understanding their motivations and their education and their mode of looking at life, we can get a much better appreciation of these buildings. And that's what we're trying to do with our historical tourism. You'll see that in the Story Bank. It's not all about stories. It's not all about Mary Poppins, but you'll see a room there talking about Stanley and his designs. So I hope you've got something from that talk. Were there any questions?
Excellent. Oh. That was very interesting.
Thank you. Thank you. Any questions?